Tomorrow it is GCSE English Literature Paper 2, and this is your comprehensive guide to getting full marks in this paper. I know, I did it. These are the strategies that helped me to do it. I'm going to go through what you should be doing the night before the exam, the morning of the exam, and strategies that you can use, including answer structures in the exam, to make sure you're hitting absolutely everything the examiners are looking for. And in particular, we're going to be focusing in on unseen poetry because too many students forget to revise unseen poetry. They think it's something that they can't revise. That is not the case, and honestly, that section is going to be the make or break between you getting the grade you want and you not. So let's get into things. First of all, night before, make sure you know what's in this paper. I'm sure you do by now. It is your modern text, it is going to be your poetry anthology, and it is going to be your unseen poetry. With each of these things, the night before, you want to be looking at a couple of very fundamental key ideas that are going to sort of be putting you on the right track. For the modern text, make sure that you are fully aware of all of the key characters, all of the key themes, and that you have a good list of quotes that are stuck in your head. Go through your quotes flashcards this evening, making sure that you know which quotes are relevant to which character and which theme. It can be really useful for you to create a little bit of a table or a mind map that details that information, just so it is really, really fresh in your head. If it helps, it did help me, if you can watch some sort of summary of the entire piece that sort of just takes you through the basic narrative. I watched, for example, for the play and then Spectacles the night before, just to sort of really have the storyline, really have the themes and the characters and the way they behave in your head. Obviously, I'm not saying read the entire book the night before, but if you can read a summary or watch a summary, then that can be really useful in prepping for you. And similarly with your poetry anthology, make sure you have a couple of good poems per theme. You've got some good quotes per poem. You know, probably 3 to 4 to 5 quotes per poem, depending. Again, go through flashcards of these if you have got them. You should have flashcards on these quotes. I think that is the most fundamental thing to help you remember them. And once again, if you can take a couple of quotes, do a little bit of an expansion, do a little bit of analysis, just to really get you prepped and in the mindset. Something that I would also do for the poetry anthology is to just go to all of the past papers and have a look at what the questions were. And if you have done all of these past papers, what I want you to do is find lists of potential questions. You can find these everywhere, just Google them and it'll come up depending on your poetry anthology. You'll be able to find something. And for each of the questions, I want you to write down what poem you would compare it to and what your 3 or 4 key points would be. And I want you to do that for about 5 or 6 different questions. The reason being, in an exam, you do not have a lot of time to pick the poem that you're going to be comparing it to. So just getting that practice in the night before, associating, okay, if it's this one, I'm going to pick that. If it's this theme in this poem, I want this one. Because you never know, particularly if you're looking at practice or predicted questions that haven't been exam paper questions, they could very much be the one that you are going to be faced with in the exam itself. For unseen poetry, I don't want you to neglect this. What I want you to do is I want you to take some random poems. And personally, I would go onto the website of the National Poetry Library, and that just has tons of poems on it. And what I would do is I would take 2 poems. You can filter by theme. So I would pick a random theme, pick the first 2 poems, and just try and outline a bullet point response, because that is essentially what you're going to face in the exam. You're going to face 2 poems that you've never seen before, and you're going to be asked to compare and contrast them and talk about them. If you have not done that, if you have not revised that, then you can't expect yourself to perform well in the exam itself. I am going to go through structure and form for answering this unseen poetry question, so we'll get to that in a sec. But please, this evening, revise some unseen poetry. Find some poems, go to the National Poetry Library, compare them, write some bullet point answers, do it 2 or 3 times, and that is going to put you ahead of 99% of students, because so many students just don't touch unseen poetry whatsoever. All that being said, that's what we're going to be doing the night before the exam. Now we're going to think about what you should be doing the morning of, just to prep your brain and to make sure that you're in a good mindset to be able to answer all the questions to the best of your ability. What I would do for a subject like English literature is you want to wake up early, but you do not want to cram. You want to glance over your quotations. Don't go through flashcards, because what I find a lot the morning of the exam, you're going to be slightly stressed, you're going to be slightly nervous, you're not going to be able to recall things straight away in the morning. Your brain needs time to wake up. And if you go straight into flashcards, you're going to make yourself feel much more nervous. as you might struggle to recall some of the quotations or some of the analysis, and you don't want that to be putting you in a bad mindset, because it will simply be because you've basically just woken up, and trying to force your brain to do intense activity the second you wake up is not going to be beneficial. So I would glance over a list of quotations. The mind map or the table that you made yesterday would be absolutely perfect for doing this. So just have a look over that. Make sure you bring spare pens and spare pens for your spare pens, please. You just don't want to be in a situation where you run out of ink in the exam and have to, stop and wait for the examiner to bring it, because you don't need that added stress. You don't need that time taken out of you trying to answer the paper. Just bring a lot of spare pens. As ever, I have been through examiners' reports, particularly for AQA, but I've also glanced at OCR and Edexcel on this as well. And we're going to be going through each section and how you should be responding to hit exactly what the examiners are wanting. So starting with your modern text. The examiners are super clear about what they want, and it's very similar to what they wanted from the play, from the Shakespeare in paper 1. And the first and most fundamental thing is that you make a really clear argument that is related to the question that is being asked of you, that is directly related to that question. So what are you going to do? You're going to put your pen down, you're going to read the question, then you're going to pick your pen up, and then you're going to underline them. Underline the key ideas, underline the key words, and if it helps, reformulate the question in your own words. What is it actually asking you to do? From there, plan, build out your structure, and you know that you're then going to be answering the actual question that is asked of you, making sure that at the end of each of your paragraphs you are linking back to that question as well. The second thing that examiners are obviously looking for is textual references. So that is, do you actually know where in the text you're getting this idea, this quotation from? What is the purpose of it being in that section of the text? And why is that quotation being used there? Who's saying it? In what moment? What's going on around? What happened before? What's going to happen after? Is there foreshadowing? Is this the conclusion of a plot line? They really want you to think about the positioning of the quotation in the context of the wider text. So you're not just plucking out and going, hey, this shows that, but not thinking about the meaning of that quotation more holistically. That is what they're really looking for if you are really wanting to get into those top bands. And building upon that, obviously, whenever you bring upon a quotation, you want perceptive analysis, structure, form, why it is being used, think about the language, and yada yada, all of that, but also conceptual awareness. So you want to be thinking about, is there anything relevant about the time at which this modern text was written? Is there anything about the author themselves that you could bring in that would add to your point? Crucially with this, you don't want to bring that in as a point on its own, because it's not a point on its own, but it should be used to develop the points that you're making already. So do they add more weight to the words in a quotation? Do they alter the meaning of a quotation if you look at it through a different lens, through the lens of a different time period, a different reader, or through the author themselves? Those can be some really impactful pieces of analysis for you to bring in as you're answering these sorts of questions. And the final thing is that they don't want you to just tell the story. Never just tell a story, because that's what the text itself does. And you're writing an analytical piece about that text. So you might want to give a bit of background information, but whenever you do, make sure that is integrated into wider analysis, and only give it if it is really, really relevant, because it takes up time and you don't get credited for it. Now, moving on, because I'm sure you have a very good structure for your modern text already, thinking about the poetry anthology. So be presented with one of the poems and a theme and asked to compare it related to that theme to another one of the poems from the anthology. That's why it's really important that you've practiced being able to do in, less than 2 minutes, choose the choice of what are you actually going to be comparing this poem to, because you don't want to be spending too much time thinking, oh, I could do this or I could do that. You just want to go for it. And that will come with practice of having done that. So again, thinking back to what examiners are really looking for in answering this, they want you to just focus on the theme. All of the time when you read the examiner's reports, they say, oh, students had some really good points of comparison, but they just were not related to the theme. You're not going to get credited for that. Even if they are the most beautiful paragraphs, if you're not talking about what it wants you to talk about, then you just can't be credited. So make sure you're sticking to the exact theme that is being spoken about. And make sure you're analysing both poems. That sounds obvious, but because you're given one poem, you might feel like you want to spend more time on that. It's safer, you've got the quotations right there in front of you, but they want an equal balance. They basically want a 50-50 split. It doesn't have to be exactly 50-50, but you don't want it to be clear that there is more weight being put on one poem compared to the other, because of course this is a comparison question, so you need to be talking about both poems to an equal degree in order to get that comparison, and crucially, the quality of your analysis for both of those poems needs to be the same. So if you're analysing the poem that you're given much better than the poem that you are comparing it to, then you're still going to constrain yourself by the level of analysis in that second poem, simply because that they're looking for this equal split, your ability to analyse things from memory as well as what is right in front of you. Of course, methods, language, structure should all be brought into it. Always be thinking about your quotations, and always be thinking about terminology, because the terminology that you use to describe poetic features differs from the terminology that you're going to use to describe features in prose. So make sure you are using the right terminology, the right keywords that really show them that actually you've revised this, you really know your stuff, and you're identifying really cool poetic techniques in there. And also try and see if you can link ideas to context, because context is so important to the poetry anthology. But as in the examiner's reports, people just miss that out. People know that you need context for your texts, for your plays, but they forget about the context in poetry. But that is so fundamental. You've really got to think about when it was written, who the author is, and why that actually matters. So don't just say, oh, the author, for example, fought in war himself. Okay, but why is that important? What does that add to the poem? What does that add to your analysis? Always be thinking about going that one step further, because that is how you really make a difference and really get those marks that you are looking for. And thinking about how you're structuring your response to this comparison. Of course, in your introduction, you want to be relating directly to the theme, stating the poem that you're going to be comparing it to, and giving a little bit of explanation why. Now, this explanation, if it doesn't flow freely from the top of your head, then I just want you to basically summarise the 3 to 4 paragraphs that are going to follow in the body, just to say, on these different aspects, there is a relation in regards to this theme. So you are going to want to be doing comparisons, thinking about comparing key ideas, how that theme is presented. Can you be thinking about both language and structure? Now, structure can be a really hard one to weave into there, but it's things like, if you're doing power and conflict, for example, and the theme was on something to do with war, and you had things like Charge of the Light Brigade and exposure, you can be talking about the different ways that the author creates a semantic field by utilising structure. So how long are the sentences? How is it split? Is it versed, or is it more free verse? What is the actual way in which that poem has been written? How does it look on a page? How does it sound when you say it? Those are the sort of structural devices. And then you'd be thinking, okay, so how does that relate to war? Does, for example, Charge of the Light Brigade make war sound fast-paced? This makes it sound, really structured and da-doom, 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 if you've read it, you know what I'm getting at. Versus exposure, that might make war seem a lot more isolated, a lot colder, a lot less structured. And, what is the impact of that? Well, can you be thinking about the way that soldiers actually feel? It's these sorts of connections that you're really trying to make. And in each of your paragraphs, you're taking your key idea, you're using quotes from both poems. Make sure you're referencing both poems, and you're always using these comparative connectives similarly. Whereas, in contrast to this, the way that I would do it is I would generally introduce the point of my paragraph. So I would say that, for example, the 2 poems present X as X. And then I would take one of the poems, I would take a quotation, I would analyse it, I would say how that relates to that theme. And then I would do the same for the second poem. But I wouldn't leave it there. I would then have a bit on the end of the paragraph where I was talking directly about the link between the 2 poems or the difference between them. So while that does slightly come through in the individual analysis that I will have done, I'm making it really explicit that I'm comparing the poems, that I'm talking about them both at the same time. Okay, unseen poetry. This is split into one question where you're analysing one of the poems and another question where you are comparing the 2 poems. So the question in which you are analysing the poem, don't get thrown. They're going to ask you to analyse it in relation to a certain theme. There is not a right answer. When you come out of the exam, you're going to get people saying, oh, I talked about this, I talked about that, I talked about this, I talked about, and they're all going to be different. And you might be sat there thinking, oh my God, all my friends talked about this one thing, I didn't talk about that, that's it, I'm done. That happened to me and I got full marks on this section, okay? Everyone had talked about certain points that I didn't talk about. I talked about different things. Crucially, examiners do not care. They care about your personal interpretation of this poem. So when you get out of that exam, don't let anyone tell you, oh, you should have talked about this. No, you shouldn't have. If you talked about that and it wasn't your personal interpretation, then it wouldn't have been a good piece of analysis because you're not looking at it as you, the reader. So remember that it is your personal interpretation that they care about. Identify language, identify structure, identify form, analyse it in all the same ways that you've been taught to analyse your poetry anthology poems, because it is the exact same principles that you are going to be rewarded for in that. Of course, subject terminology, use it naturally, explore the effects on the reader. You are the reader. You are reading this poem almost 100% likely for the first time. You need to be talking about, what does it make you feel? What is your gut reaction? And then does that change as you analyse it more? That can be a really, really powerful way of structuring a paragraph in answering unseen poetry. It shows a real depth of understanding and perceptiveness as a student of English to go in there and say, okay, at first glance, this poem appears to say something about this theme. However, looking in more detail at this quotation, analyse it. At this quotation, analyse it. The reader comes to realise that, there is more depth, there's more perception, there's a different underlying meaning. Just make sure that when you are doing that, you're not saying I, you're using the reader in place of I, because you are the reader in that case. You're making a more general point, therefore. And please try not to waffle. It's really easy to do it in this, but they are not looking for a really, really extensive response. They want something that is powerful and that has good personal interpretation and good analysis. So keep it short, bit of an introduction, 2 to 3 analytical paragraphs, sorry, not comparison, don't do comparison on this question, it's not asking you to do that, just analyse, and then write a little bit of conclusion, summarising how that theme is presented in that poem. Now, for the 8 marker, you are comparing. I've got a little list of what the examiners want because this is very crucial. They care about short, focused comparison on the methods. The differences in the way that theme is presented. So think about how you would write about differences in the poetry anthology question. If the 2 poems had presented a theme in a different way, that is the exact same way that you want to be writing about this. You don't want to be waffling. Things can be short. They're not trying to trick you out. If there is an obvious difference between the poems, if there is an obvious similarity, that is what you want to talk about. They don't make this, they make this section quite easy, quite obvious. They're not looking for these really, really deep analytical meanings if you can't find them. If you can find them, amazing, write about them. If you can't, don't think that you're doing badly, that they're not there to trick you. And you're saying what's similar, what's different in tone, technique, theme, and you don't need a big introduction and conclusion. In fact, they're not strictly necessary. I would still write a sentence at the start that basically says this is their main similarity, their main difference, and conclude with a little bit of a summary and add any additional information if you want, but you don't need a big formal structured intro or conclusion. That is not rewarded. As ever, do make sure that you are strict on timing with yourself. You don't have a lot of time. You need to be checking the clock. Make sure you are moving on. If you're spending ages on, for example, the first question of unseen poetry, make sure you move on to that second 8 marker because it is really easy to get those 8 marks. If you attempt that question, you have a little introduction, you have a little conclusion, like 1 sentence, and you have 2 to 3 points of analysis, you will get 8 marks. That question is there because a lot of students don't even answer it because they don't have time, they haven't managed their time effectively. Answer it, you'll get the 8 marks. Even if that means that you're cutting your response to the first one short, you'd rather pick up these marks. Make sure you're looking at the clock. Give yourself 5 minutes at the end to check. Good luck, and that is how you are absolutely going to smash your English Literature GCSE Paper 2. See you in the next video.